Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with baked apple roses. That's right, we've all been there before. You bite into an apple and you think to yourself, this is good, but I wish it was like 75% pastry and shaped like a rose. Well, I think we've come up with something perfect for that exact situation. And the good news is it's way easier than it looks, because you do have to admit it looks pretty complicated. But as you're about to see, it's actually quite simple. So let's go ahead and get started. And first up, we're going to need to slice and soften some apple. So I'm going to take a red apple. Anything that would work in an apple pie is going to work here. And I'm going to cut it in half, and then we'll trim off the end. And using a very sharp knife, we'll make some beautifully even thin slices. All right, that one was a little thick. That's better. So as you can see here, we want these nice and thin. And by the way, we're definitely leaving the skin on. As you'll see, that adds a very important visual element later. So we'll slice our halved apple nice and thin. And I guess we could have cored the apple before we started slicing, but I actually prefer to do it afterward. So I'm just removing the bare minimum. And I just like using one of these little round pastry cutters. And by the way, from what I've heard, as long as you remove the seeds, you can eat everything else. So this could be unnecessary, but I did it anyway. And then once our apples are sliced and possibly cored, we're going to transfer those onto a plate, because these apples have to be softened a little bit before we start rolling the pastry, otherwise they'll break. So we'll throw those on a plate, and it's okay if they overlap a little bit. And then all we need to do is microwave these for about 45 seconds or so, or until they just go limp. And by the way, if you don't have a microwave, I will give you some alternatives on the blog post. So to test, give them a little wiggle, and if they kind of flap around a little bit like that, they're done. Okay, we don't want mushy. Like I said, we just want to be able to work with these without them breaking. So to hedge my bets, what I like to do is put over a piece of plastic, and then a towel to kind of keep that heat in there, and I'll just let those sit, continuing to soften a little bit, while I move on to prep the pastry. So what we want to use for this ideally is a couple pieces of puff pastry, which is sort of what I have here. Truth be told, this is actually some trimmings from a very exciting experiment I just did, where I tried to create a puff pastry using biscuit dough. So stay tuned for that at some point in the future. But for the sake of this video, we're going to pretend it's puff pastry. And on a floured surface, what we need to do is somehow, some way, roll this out nice and thin into something roughly, 3 inches or so by maybe 12 to 15 inches. And the final thickness should probably be just under 1/8 of an inch. So I tried to get it as close as I could with the rolling pin before switching to the trusty old pizza cutter for the final trimming. And you've probably figured out I'm just making 2 here, but this is not a recipe, it's a technique. So depending on how much pastry and apples you have around, you can scale this up to as many as you want. And then once our pastry has been rolled and trimmed to the appropriate size, we're going to take a little bit of melted butter and spread it all over the surface. And yes, we usually do use a pastry brush for this, but I felt like spooning, which works just as good, and easier to clean, by the way. And then once our dough has been buttered, we're going to sprinkle on a very generous application of cinnamon sugar, which of course is just sugar that has cinnamon stirred into it. And of course, you could sprinkle the cinnamon and the sugar separately, but this method will ensure complete and perfect distribution. And then once that's mixed up, we will sprinkle that over our butter. And by the way, how much you put on is totally up to you. Okay, I went fairly light here, because as you know, I'm very health conscious. But if you want something a little stickier, a little sweeter, a little more decadent, you could easily put down twice as much as you see me doing here. I mean, you guys are the Jeremiah Towers of your baked apples shaped like flowers. So that's totally up to you. And at this point, we can go ahead and start laying down our apple slices. So we'll start placing those down along the edge. And by the way, you want to start probably about 1 inch in from the end so that we have a little bit of plain dough left when we finish our rolling. So we'll place those down, overlapping partially as you can see. And what we want is for the top of the apple to extend about 1/8 or 1/4 inch past the edge of the dough. But of course, having said that, a little variance is fine. If some are a little higher, some are a little lower, that's all going to add to what we hope is a very realistic look. And then once our apples are in position, we'll simply fold the bottom half of the dough up over, just like this. Then we'll kind of press down and seal the ends. And you should end up with something resembling this. And then what we want to do next is paint the surface of the dough with a little bit of egg wash, which is nothing more than an egg beaten with a couple teaspoons of water, and we'll brush that on, after which we will do one more application of our cinnamon sugar, and again, totally up to you with how heavy-handed to be, and at that point we are finally ready to roll. So we'll start at one end and roll it up towards the other, keeping it as even as possible, and of course that pastry is going to expand a little when it cooks, so do not roll this super tight, just roll it up like this, and you should end up with something that looks very similar to a rose. Check it out. And then we'll want to take that little extra piece of dough and kind of stretch it around like this to keep everything together. So like I said, a fairly simple procedure. So I'll go ahead and I'll roll up my second rose the exact same way. And apparently this one had a little less dough or less apples because it did come out a little smaller. But that didn't bother me. I'm Chef John, not Chef Robot. So you have to expect some variations. And then once our roses are rolled, we're going to transfer those into some buttered and sugared ramekins. So just brush a couple appropriately sized ramekins with butter, and then dust them with some white sugar, shaking out any excess. And then, like I said, we will transfer the roses into the ramekins. And yes, by the way, you can use muffin tins for this, although the cooking times might vary, but we'll talk about that on the blog as well. And then once those are placed in, last but not least, one last little dusting on top with the cinnamon sugar, at which point these are ready for the oven. So let's go ahead and transfer those into the center of a 400-degree oven for about 45 minutes. And we're going to want to place these right on the rack, so be careful. Okay, the bottoms aren't going to cook as well as if you put them on a pan. So we'll place them just like that, and we will bake those for about 45 minutes or until well browned and looking absolutely gorgeous, which I'll show you in a second. But first, one tip, when you take these out of the oven, plate safe and use some tongs with a pan underneath in case they slip. But anyway, like I said, we're going to cook those about 45 minutes or until they look like this. And then what we want to do is let these cool for about 5 or 10 minutes in the ramekin before unmolding these while they're still warm. And in case you're interested, while they are still warm, you could take your tongs and kind of pull up and or move around those apple slice rose petals to make them look even more perfect. But anyway, like I said, we'll let those sit for about 5 or 10 minutes before removing them from the ramekin. And if necessary, you could just use a paring knife to loosen it up. But as long as these are still pretty hot, they should come out relatively easy, which mine did. And as you can see, that pastry got nice and golden brown. So if yours don't look like that when you unmold them, put them back in. And at this point, all we have to do is let them cool. So I did transfer mine onto a rack to cool completely. And once that happened, I was ready for the official final touch, a little dusting of powdered sugar, which, as you know, I don't like. I'm really not a fan of the powdered sugar. But the consultants tell me that if I use it, I have a 45% better chance of someone sharing this on Pinterest. So sometimes you got to do what you got to do. So a little powdered sugar, and at that point, those baked apple roses are done. And just looking absolutely beautiful. And I'll admit, even if these tasted terrible, I would still make them because they just look so amazing. But I'm happy to report they don't taste terrible. They taste incredible and sound incredible. All right, that crispy, flaky pastry surrounding those sweet, perfectly cooked apples. This is like an entire handful of the best parts of an apple pie. So I just love everything about these. In fact, the only real problem I have with this is what to actually call it, since it's a little hard to categorize. I mean, when people hear apple rose, they think of an apple carved into a rose. But what other name would work? It's not a tart, it's not a turnover, it's not a Danish, although it's kind of rolled up like one, but not a Danish. So that's the only minor issue here. But you know what? It really is much to do about nothing. Because to paraphrase the late great William Shakespeare, an apple rose by any other name would taste and look as sweet. So I really do hope you give this a try. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Honeycrisp apple tart for one. That's right, I'm going to show you how to make a fun-size apple tart that looks like something that would come out of a professional pastry shop, yet is so simple and so easy. It could be made by someone who's never baked before. And we're going to do all this with just a few ingredients and no special equipment, unless you consider a potato peeler special equipment, which, believe it or not, is our secret weapon to make this recipe. But first things first, and before we get to that, we have to prep our crust, which is going to be super easy since we're using a sheet of frozen puff pastry. And what we'll do is take a cutter the exact same size as the ramekins we're going to bake these in, and we'll go ahead and punch out 2 pieces. Oh, and if you don't have a set of these round pastry cutters, don't feel bad. Just simply place the ramekin you're using over the dough and trace around with the tip of a knife. And then what we'll do once those have been cut and placed on a parchment lined pan is take a fork and dock the dough. And docking is just a culinary term so we don't have to say pricking the dough. And by making a bunch of holes in the dough with a fork like this, that's going to help prevent it from puffing up too much and also allow steam to escape. And then later on when we bake this with our apple, it's going to help us produce a beautiful crisp crust. And that's it. Once we finish docking, we can move to baking, as we're going to pop these into a 400-degree oven for about 15 minutes, or until they look like this. And then what we'll do is slide these off the pan so they cool down faster. And by the way, I would love for someone to tell me why these turned out oval. I mean, weren't those round when we put them in the oven? So I was a little confused by that. Anyway, while these are still warm, we'll give them a little pressing with the fork to sort of deflate them a bit, which is going to help give us a little bit of a crispier texture later. And then what we'll do is let those cool down while we move on to our sugar mixture, which will include some brown sugar, some white sugar, a small pinch of cinnamon, and an even smaller pinch of salt. Right, just a little bit. And once all that's in there, we'll give it a mix and simply set it aside while we move on to butter our ramekins, which is an easy but crucial step, since we really do want to be fairly generous here because butter is a key ingredient in any successful apple pie or tart. Okay, so don't be shy. And we really do want to make sure these are very, very well buttered. And then once those are set, we'll take our sugar mixture and we will evenly distribute it between the two ramekins. But we don't want to put every last bit of it in at this point. Okay, I want you to save about 1.5 teaspoons so that we can apply that to the top of our apple later. And that's it. Once those have been sugared, we'll go ahead and give those the old shake-a. And then we can set those aside while we move on to prep our apples. And by prep, I mostly mean peel. But before we do that, we'll go ahead and trim a little bit off each end, which may or may not be necessary. But for me, I think it helps square this off and also helps me cut this right in half a little more evenly, which is the next thing we need to do. At which point we'll grab those two halves in our pull-down style potato peeler, and we'll head over to a nice cold fresh bowl of water, into which we're going to squeeze about 1 teaspoon of lemon juice, which will help prevent our apples from oxidizing, but also maybe give them a little tiny hint of flavor. And then what we'll do here is take our peeler and go ahead and peel each of these halves into as long ribbons as we can, at least when we start out. And no, we're probably not going to use those first few inches of the peel, since it's mostly skin. But as we go around, we're going to get into the flesh, which as you'll see, we're eventually going to roll up to form what's basically going to be our apple filling. And while it's nice that the first few pieces end up kind of long, as long as these ribbons are like 3 or 4 inches long, we're good. And even if you do end up with a few really short pieces, those can get stuck in here and there and still be used. And basically, we're going to keep peeling like this until we get all the way down to the core. And then what we'll do once we peeled as much as we can is pull out 3 or 4 of our longest ribbons, and we'll go ahead and line those up as straight as we can. And then we will start rolling from one end, as tight as we can without it breaking, to form what's basically going to look like a rose. And as far as portioning goes, depending on the size, probably 1 apple per tart is a good guess. Although who knows, you might need 1.5. And if you have to peel some more, you'll peel some more. No big deal. And then once we have that center formed, we can go ahead and turn it up on its end. And then we'll simply take ribbons out of the bowl, and we will coil them around the center. And by overlapping the next piece, that will hold the previous piece in place. And we will simply continue on repeating that process until we have a coil of peeled apple exactly the same size as our ramekin. And I'm sure you've heard me say many times that surface area equals flavor. So by making our filling out of these rolled apple peels, we are utilizing a ton of surface area, which is going to give us a ton of apple flavor. Okay, this is why deli sandwiches always taste better, since they're cutting their meat paper thin on a slicer, as opposed to us at home with the exact same piece of meat, and we're hacking off like 1/4 inch thick slices. Right, same meat, totally different sandwich experience. So it's not a perfect analogy, but that's basically what's going on here. But anyway, once we have this built up to the same diameter as our ramekin, we'll go ahead and pick it up and transfer it into our ramekin on top of the sugar. But we'll do that with the flat side, the side that was on the table, facing the sugar. Because eventually once this bakes and gets turned out, that's going to be the top. So I went ahead and did one more. And yes, as the recipe name would indicate, this is a Honeycrisp apple. But any baking apple like a Granny Smith will work. And then what we'll do before we add our crust is go ahead and place over a little bit of butter. Right, not too much, maybe 1/2 teaspoon or so. Followed by that little bit of sugar mixture we saved, which I said was going to be like 1.5 teaspoons. So we'll go ahead and sprinkle that over each one, which if my math is correct, is going to be about 3/4 teaspoon. And that's it. Once our apples have been buttered and sugared, we'll go ahead and place over our puff pastry rounds with that golden brown side up. And by rounds, I mean ovals. And I use that time-tested technique where if it doesn't fit, just force it. Oh yeah, I learned that putting IKEA furniture together. And since these were pretty close to round, it wasn't a major deal, but it was still a little bit annoying, mostly because I'm not sure why it happened. But hey, that's why I like cooking so much. So many mysteries. And that's it. Once I had my oval pegs placed in my round holes, those were ready to transfer into the upper center of a 425-degree oven for about 30 minutes, or until the tops were brown and the syrups were bubbling. And they looked like this. And then what we'll do while these are still piping hot is take our fork and give them a little pressing, just to sort of compact everything down a bit. At which point we'll let these cool for about 10 minutes before turning them out on a plate. But before we do that, I like to go around with a knife just to make sure our pastry's not sticking to the edges. So we'll go around with the tip of a knife to make sure that's not happening. And that's it as far as the dismount goes. We will simply tip that over onto a plate and hope for the best. And as you can see, mine came out beautifully, except for that one little peel in the back, which I simply pushed back in place. So yes, while these are still warm, you can go ahead and take your fingers and fix any imperfections. Although, like I said, I was very happy with how this came out. But why just be happy with something when we can possibly make it look even better? So if we want at this point, we can take a spoon and just sort of go around in between those layers, just separating those a little bit and give that top surface a little more definition. And that's it. We could serve it like this, since it is absolutely gorgeous. But if we want it to look even more professional, we could, if we want, brush a little bit of simple syrup over the top, which, as you know, is 2 parts sugar to 1 part water brought to a boil. Or in the bakery, we would brush over some melted apricot jam, and that's just to give the top a little bit of a shine. And then last but certainly not least, I'm going to finish up with a scoop of vanilla ice cream. Or instead, if you want, you could use a scoop of whipped cream. Or Michelle's recommendation, some whipped creme fraiche. But of course, that's going to be up to you. I mean, you guys are after all the Kenjis of how to present these. But no matter what you serve alongside, once you grab a fork and dig in, I think you'll agree this is not just one of the most beautiful apple tarts you've ever seen. It's going to be one of the most delicious. And that's because we hardly did anything to it. I mean, we don't need to. We have buttery, crispy pastry, just a massive amount of apple flavor, with it being sweetened just enough with that little touch of sugar and cinnamon. And what's really interesting here, even though those pieces of apple were super thin, the texture in the final product is not soft and mushy. Right? Somehow, some way, the apple actually retains a little bit of firmness, just a little bit. And what I really love so much about this little tartlet, besides all that stuff I just said about the taste and texture, is that pretty much anyone, whether they've ever baked anything before in their life or not, will be able to produce something that looks like it was made by a professional pastry chef. And believe you me, they are not happy about it. All right, they want everyone to think this stuff is super hard. But we're on to you, pastry chefs. But anyway, that's it. What I'm calling Honeycrisp Apple Tart for one. Whether you're looking for something to make for that special someone on date night, or you just want to trick your guests into thinking you have professional pastry skills, or, and this might be the most popular reason, you just wanted one portion of what's basically a perfect apple pie. But no matter what your motivation is, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Portuguese custard tarts. That's right, I'm going to show you how to make pastéis de nata, which are truly one of the world's most amazing pastries. And believe it or not, invented by Portuguese monks many, many centuries ago. Which kind of makes sense. I mean, if you're going to take a vow of poverty and a vow of chastity, that is going to free up a lot of time to practice your pastry skills. And man, did they perfect this recipe. So with a very sincere thank you to the Hieronymites, let's go ahead and get started with what is basically the simplest dough you can make, which consists of nothing more than flour, some salt, and some water. And then what we'll do is grab a wooden spoon and give this a mix until it just comes together and pulls away from the bowl. And fair warning, this is going to be a very wet and sticky dough. And once those 3 ingredients come together and look a little something like this, we'll go ahead and transfer that onto a very well-floured surface. And we'll dust a little more flour over the top. And then we're just going to give it a few seconds of kneading and circular rubbing until we get that into some kind of semi-roundish shape. And once that's been accomplished, we will dust on a little more flour. And then we'll cover that with our bowl and let it rest about 15 or 20 minutes. And no peeking. And all we're doing is letting the dough relax a little bit, so it's a little easier to work with. And then what we'll do after about 15 or 20 minutes is uncover it. And then using as much flour as necessary, we're going to press, roll, and stretch this into a square about 1/8 of an inch thick. And yes, this would be a lot easier to work with if the dough was drier, but you're just not going to get that same final effect. So even though it's going to be a little annoying to work with, we really do want to start with a very sticky dough. And then what we're going to do once we have that rolled and stretched out into a square is apply the only other ingredient here, some very, very soft spreadable butter. And what we want to do is apply exactly 1/3 of our butter to exactly 2/3 of this square. And as we're spreading this, we're going to try to leave about 1 inch of the outside edge unbuttered. And by the way, if you try doing this with butter that's not super soft, it won't work. All right, you're going to end up tearing and pulling your dough. So make sure it's very, very soft and spreadable. And then what we'll do once we have 2/3 covered is take the third that's not buttered and flip that over. And then we will flip that other side over to complete our letter fold. And yes, I did flip that first side over too far. So I kind of had to stretch this to make it fit and tore it a little. But don't worry, it's all going to be fine. I just went ahead and squared that up the best I could. And then with the help of our bench scraper, we'll go ahead and turn the dough. And we will sprinkle on even more flour. And then we'll give that a flip. And then apply even more flour. Did I mention this was sticky? So do not be shy with the flour. And then once we do have that turned and floured, we'll go ahead and roll that out into a rectangular shape about 1/8 of an inch thick. And if you're really good at this, you're not going to have any bubbles inside, which is why I have bubbles. But as I kept rolling, those eventually got pressed out. But anyway, like I said, we'll go ahead and roll that out into a rectangle. And if you have to give it a little stretch here and there, don't be afraid. And then once that's set, we're going to repeat the thing we just did. Okay, we're going to take another 1/3 of our butter and spread it over 2/3 of our surface. And then repeat the letter fold by taking the unbuttered third and folding that over. And then the opposite third over the top of that. And then we'll square it up and even it out the best we can. And then once that's been accomplished, before we apply the last of our butter, I'm going to go ahead and transfer this onto a baking sheet and pop this in the fridge for just about 10 minutes to chill that butter just a little bit. But I wouldn't go too much longer because we don't want it to get hard. So I popped it in there for about 10 minutes before pulling it back out for the final rolling. And good news, this is the last step. So we'll go ahead and flour that generously and roll that out into a square about 1/8 of an inch thick, maybe a touch thicker. All right, let's say 3/16. And then what we'll do once that's been rolled out is apply the last third of our soft butter. And this time we can spread our butter all the way to the edges, except on the top edge. All right, at the top we're going to leave about 1 inch to 1.5 inches unbuttered, because that's where we're going to seal our dough after we roll it. And what we'll do once that's all buttered is take a wet finger and ever so slightly moisten that unbuttered edge. And then to finish this up, instead of folding it, what we're going to do is slowly but surely roll this up from the bottom. All right, nice and tight, attempting to get this as uniformly shaped as possible. And while I'm doing this, I should mention, once we roll this up, we're going to have to wrap it and refrigerate it for a few hours, preferably overnight before we can start using it. So just a little time management heads up. And I actually did this exact recipe last night so I'd have one to work with. So yes, I did 2 of these rolls. Well, actually, technically 3. Since I tested one of these rolls using pre-made puff pastry, which was a dismal failure, and I'll talk about that in the blog post. But anyway, we're going to continue rolling that all the way up to our unbuttered, slightly damp edge, which should hopefully seal this tube nicely. And then if we want, we can sprinkle on a little more flour and do some final shaping and evening out. But mine was pretty uniform, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap that in plastic. And like I said, pop that in the fridge, preferably overnight. And yes, in case you're wondering, you can absolutely freeze this dough. Just wrap it up nice and tight, and then let it thaw overnight in the fridge when you're ready to use it. But anyway, once our dough is set, we can move on to the custard, which is going to start with a simple syrup. So to the saucepan, we're going to add some white sugar, a splash of water, 1 cinnamon stick, and the peeled zest from 1 lemon. And make sure you wash your lemon in hot water first, in case it has any weird wax on the outside. And then once we have that all together, we're going to head to the stove, and we'll place that over medium heat. And we're going to want to bring this up to a boil. And by the way, you're not supposed to stir this. I do because I can't help myself, but it is totally unnecessary and you probably shouldn't. But anyway, all we need to do here is boil this until it reaches a temperature of 210 to 215 degrees Fahrenheit. Or as a Portuguese monk would call it, 100 degrees Celsius. And as soon as that happens, we will turn it off. And there I go again, stirring it for no apparent reason. But anyway, we'll simply turn that off and reserve it until our final component is done. And that's going to be our custard base, which is going to consist of some flour, some salt, and some cold milk, which we're going to whisk for a few minutes before heading to the stove. And then what we're going to do once we've whisked that all together very, very thoroughly is place that over medium heat and cook it stirring until it thickens up. Oh, and I should mention I've actually streamlined this part of the recipe, since classically the flour is mixed with a small amount of milk, and then the rest of the milk is heated, or tempered as we say. and then everything is whisked together. But I figured since we're going to strain it anyway, let's just take a chance. And it actually worked out fine. So yes, I guess I am sort of saying they've been doing it wrong for centuries in Portugal. But hey, at least now they know. But anyway, like I said, we're going to cook this over medium, whisking pretty much the whole time, until our mixture thickens up, at which point you should have something that looks very similar to this. And then what we're going to want to do is turn off the heat and let this sit for at least 10 minutes before whisking in our egg yolks. Alright, if you're a super fast whisker, you could probably mix them in right away. But to play it safe, it's not a bad idea to wait about 10 minutes. And we'll go ahead and whisk those yolks in. And once we have those incorporated, we'll go ahead and finish this off by adding our sugar syrup. Plus, we will also add a spoon of vanilla extract. And I should mention the vanilla, cinnamon, and lemon should all be considered optional. Alright, a lot of the so-called authentic recipes don't call for those. So you decide. I mean, you are after all the Hieronymite of what tastes right. But I like them, so I put them. And we'll give that all one final mix. And then, like I said, we are going to strain this, which is going to catch our lemon peel, cinnamon stick, and any undissolved lumps or chunks of flour, which I didn't really have any of. And the reason we're straining this into a measuring cup is because that's going to make it a lot easier to pour into our pastry shells. And forming those is going to be the next step. So we'll simply set our custard aside, and I'm going to go ahead and pull out the dough I made last night, which because I wasn't filming came out a little neater, but the exact same recipe. And we'll go ahead and unwrap that and cut a little bit off both ends. But don't discard that, in case we have to do a little bit of patching. And then we'll take our knife and score this into exactly 12 even pieces. And then let me go ahead and cut a couple of these, so you can get a good look at what's going on here. Okay, right here you should be able to see that swirl of dough and butter. And don't forget in the dough layer, there's actually layers of butter from the 2 folds we did earlier. So that's exactly what we want it to look like. And then to shape the dough, what we'll do is place one of these rolls at the bottom of each muffin cup. And we'll dip our thumb into some cold water. And then we'll push that right down into the center of that roll. And then we'll slowly but surely spread that out across the bottom. And then eventually up the sides. And it might not seem like you have enough dough, but you do. Okay, we really want to get this stuff nice and thin. And dipping your fingers in cold water really is key here, since that's going to make it way easier to push and spread that dough up the sides. And one huge tip here, make sure you go at least 1/8 of an inch up past the top. Okay, because what'll happen if you don't get these high enough is your custard is going to bake up over the top and run down the sides, and it will burn and look black. So again, using wet fingers, make sure you smear and spread that stuff all the way up, not only to get it nice and thin, but like I said, so we have at least 1/8 of an inch popping up above the edge. And if you want, you can do this step a little bit ahead, and then just refrigerate that pan as is, and fill it with the custard later. And then what we're going to do once our tart shells have been formed, is go ahead and pour in our custard batter, but not all the way up. We only want to go about 3/4. Alright, this custard is going to kind of puff up as it bakes, and if you fill them up too high, as I touched on earlier, it's going to spill over and get between the dough and the pan. And it definitely will burn since this is going to go in such a hot oven. So like I said, we'll just go 3/4 of the way. And that's it. Once we have those filled, we will carefully transfer that into the center of a super hot 550-degree oven, or whatever your highest setting is. And we will bake those for about 12 to 14 minutes, or until our pastry is well browned and bubbling in butter, and our custard is just barely set. So for ones done in a home oven, those are looking pretty nice. Right, in Portugal, the ovens are even hotter, so the top of the custards get even more caramelized and blistered. But you know what? These were looking just fine. And right here you can get a great look at all that lamination, which is that layer of butter between the pastry. And while admittedly that took a little bit of work to do, that really is the secret behind these incredible tarts. And we're definitely going to want to let these cool a little bit before we try to pull one out. Although they are supposed to be served warm, so don't wait too long. So I waited a little bit and went ahead and popped one out. And as you can see, our pastry got beautifully browned. And if you look close, you can actually see the spiral from our rolled dough. But anyway, let me go ahead and bite in so I can taste and hear how we did. And yes, it really was that crispy. And the perfect delivery system for that rich, creamy custard. Although it should have cooled a little bit more, since these really should be served warm and not hot. So I finished eating that one while I transferred the rest onto a rack to cool a little bit more. And after about 10 minutes, I plated one up, so I could take some pictures, but more importantly, eat another one. And the contrast here between that ultra crispy, flaky, buttery crust and that soft, creamy custard subtly scented with cinnamon and lemon is nothing like I've ever experienced eating any other pastry. I mean, it really is truly remarkable. And yes, there was a little bit of work involved in making that pastry. But when you finally get around to enjoy these, you will regret nothing. Except maybe not making a double batch. Okay, you should probably make 24 of these. But anyway, that's it. How I do Portuguese custard tarts. I'm not sure whether you have a bucket list or not. And if you do, whether it has a section for pastries. But if it does, stop whatever you're doing and add these to that list. So needless to say, I really do hope you give these a try soon. And you should definitely head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Tarte Flambée. That's right, do not be misled by that misleading name. This is really closer to a pizza than a tart. And we are definitely not going to set it on fire. At least not on purpose. And speaking of names, you wouldn't know it by looking, but apparently this Alsatian sensation is actually a German invention. So I'm not exactly sure why they went with the French name. All I can think is that maybe the German one had too many consonants. But regardless, this is very simple to put together, great for entertaining groups, and incredibly delicious. So let's go ahead and get started with the first of 4 very simple components, and that would be the bacon. So what I have here is 12 ounces of sliced up bacon that we're going to set over medium-high heat. And we're going to cook this stirring occasionally, but not all the way. Okay, all we're trying to do here is render out most of that fat. And while we do want the bacon cooked, we don't want it crisp. So all we're going to do is continue cooking until we have something that looks like this. Okay, like I said, a lot of that fat's going to render out. But the bacon is not starting to crisp up yet. So that's looking perfect right there. And what we can do at this point is remove it from the heat and transfer that into a strainer set over a bowl. Because having some rendered bacon fat around is never a bad thing. Plus, we don't want our tarte flambée oversaturated with grease. So we'll go ahead and let that drain and cool down, of course. Oh, and by the way, in case you didn't know, any bacon you accidentally drop on the table, you get to eat. Oh yeah, that's the rule. Besides, it's never a bad idea to taste some for quality control purposes. But anyway, once our bacon is set, we can move on to the second component, the sliced onions. And the reason we're doing these after the bacon is because we're going to use that same pan. So let's place that back on medium heat and add in 1 thinly sliced onion, along with a fairly generous pinch of salt. And there's probably going to be enough bacon fat attached to the pan for this step, but if it seems too dry, you can go ahead and throw in a spoon of our rendered fat. That's just you cooking. And all we're going to do here is cook these onions very briefly until they just lose their rigidity and start to soften up a little. Okay, so just like the bacon, we're giving these a little bit of a head start. And of course, because we added some salt, that's going to draw moisture out of the onions, which is going to deglaze any of that goodness off the bottom of the pan. And as I mentioned, we're only going to cook these until they start to soften up. Okay, the biggest mistake people make with this recipe is using caramelized onions, which in my opinion are way too soft and sweet for this recipe. So I'm recommending we cook these until they just lose that raw edge. And they're going to start to look a little bit wet. So for me, that's perfect right there. Okay, as soon as our onions get to this point, we're going to stop. We're going to turn off the heat. And we are simply going to let those cool down to room temp. Okay, so our onions are set, our bacon's set, and we can move on to an equally easy component, the cheese mixture, which is going to start with this, fromage blanc. Oh yeah, I'm going to make you go to the fancy grocery store to find some fromage blanc. Or I guess you can make your own, since we do have a video for that. Which, by the way, fun fact, I believe was our first viral video. But anyway, if you're not familiar, fromage blanc is an extra delicious, extra tangy French-style cream cheese. And then to that, we're also going to add some creme fraiche. Another thing you can make homemade with one of our videos. So I'm going to go ahead and add some creme fraiche. And please note how very carefully I'm measuring that. And then besides our dairy, we will also season this up with some freshly grated nutmeg. And I'm not sure if I've mentioned before, but I much prefer the freshly grated to the pre-ground. It's basically like the difference between listening to the Rolling Stones and just an actual Rolling Stone. So we'll do a little touch of nutmeg, followed by a nice big pinch of salt, as well as some very traditional freshly ground black pepper. And then last but not least, a very untraditional shake of cayenne pepper. Hey, I'm sure it would have been very traditional if they had it around. And believe it or not, that's it for our cheese spread. So we'll go ahead and take a spoon and mix that up. And it's probably obvious, but let me mention it anyway. You can certainly add other, possibly stinkier cheeses to this mixture. I've had these with Munster and Gruyere, and they're very delicious. So if you wanted to funk this up a little bit by using one of those, feel free. You are, after all, the Bruno Mars of which cheese stars. But anyway, like I said, we will give that a mix. And simply set that aside while we finish our last component, the tart crust. And for that, we're going to need about a 5-ounce ball of pizza dough, which conveniently is exactly 1/4 of our Wolfgang Puck pizza dough recipe. So we'll go ahead and whip up a batch of that. And we'll place 1/4 of that down on a well-floured surface. And then using our hands and a rolling pin, and of course enough flour to keep it from sticking, what we want to do is roll that out very thin to about a 10 or 12-inch circle. And I mean thin, like less than 1/8 of an inch. Okay, having a thin, crispy crust is key here. And yes, in case you're wondering, because we made you slice onions and bacon, you are allowed to buy that bag of pre-made pizza dough at the store. But anyway, we're going to roll that out nice and thin as shown, at which point we're going to transfer that into our cold cast iron pan. And to make that move a little easier, what we'll do is roll our dough over our pin like this. Whoops. Actually, like this. And that's going to allow us to transfer it into the pan without it getting all messed up. Like that. Well, we tried. So let's go ahead and straighten that out. And then what we'll do at this point is transfer that on to medium-high heat, because what we're going to do is pre-cook the bottom of this crust. So we're going to place that on medium-high heat, and it's going to take a few minutes to come up to temp. And as it does, you're going to see little bubbles forming, which I'm going to recommend we poke with a fork. Okay, so those are little ones. But eventually you'll see bigger ones, and maybe even the occasional giant one. And the reason we'll pop those is because this isn't a pizza. We don't want something bubbly and chewy. We want something thin and kind of crispy. So that is the thought process behind the debubbling. And what we're going to do is keep cooking that on medium-high until our bottom is nicely browned. So let's flip that over and take a look. Okay, you see that? That is perfect right there. It is just about to start getting charred. So at that point, we can go ahead and pull it off the heat and proceed to top it with our other 3 components. So first up, we will spread over a very generous application of our cheese mixture. And don't be shy, we want a good amount of this stuff. And by the way, the reason for the pre-cooking of the crust, and the onions and the bacon for that matter, is because we need to successfully accomplish this in a home oven. Right, the word flambé in the name actually refers to the fact this used to be cooked in a fire. And it was that intense heat that caramelized the bacon, softened the onions, and produced that beautifully brown, crispy crust. So in order to simulate that in a home oven, we needed to give all these ingredients a head start. But anyway, we'll go ahead and spread over our fromage blanc mixture, followed by our now room temperature onions. And we will attempt to distribute those fairly evenly over the top. And for something like this, the rule of thumb for how much to put on is that we go until we start to have trouble figuring out where to put the next one. So when you have to start pausing to figure out where they should be placed, you probably have enough. And then once the onions are set, we'll go ahead and finish up with our bacon. And by the way, regarding authenticity, I'm probably putting on 3 to 4 times the amount of bacon you normally get. But it's fine, I'm an American. So we'll go ahead and scatter over as much bacon as we think reasonable, at which point this is ready to finish by crisping up in a very hot oven, or under a broiler, which is how I did it. And I'll cover in the blog post all your options for cooking this, but 5 to 10 minutes in a very, very, very hot oven or under the broiler should do it. And since we already browned the bottom of our crust, all we're really worrying about is cooking and crisping the top. So this is what mine looked like after about 5 or 6 minutes under the broiler. As you can see, our bacon is caramelized perfectly, and the edges of our crust is beautifully browned. And one sign you know you got your crust thin enough is you see how it's kind of curling up around the edge, kind of lifting up from the pan? That was done with the proper thinness. In fact, let me lift this up and do a freeze frame, and we can see how beautifully browned it is, and it's so thin the light's coming through. So long story short, we nailed it. And at this point, we can go ahead and cut that in quarters, and I will serve that up on my traditional Alsatian platter. And then for a little bit of color, I'm going to add 1 sprig of thyme for each slice. And since that is not traditional, I'm going to leave it whole. So if someone wants it, they can pick those leaves off, or if not, they can just pull that off. In California, we call that empowering our guests. And I do like the thyme, but for the sake of time, I'm going to pull that off and start eating. And that, my friends, is one of the most delicious things you'll ever eat. Right? We have smoky caramelized bacon sitting on top of sweet soft onions, which are nestled into that creamy, tangy, cheesy mixture, all being moved to our face with that beautiful crispy crust. And did I mention these are perfect for a party? Since we can make a whole bunch of those tart crusts ahead of time, and then top them and just pop them under the broiler or in the oven when we're ready to serve. But regardless, whether for a large group or a small group, just an absolutely fantastic bite of food. But anyway, that's it, my take on Tarte Flambée. Despite the sort of funny name, and the fact you're going to spend half your party explaining to guests why this is not called pizza, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Fresh Fig and Goat Cheese Tart. That's right, there's a reason there's quotations around the word tart, because I'm really not sure that's what this is. I mean, I started out trying to make sort of a savory freeform tart, but after a catastrophic crust failure, I was forced to change plans and snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. And by the way, if you guys are good, I'm going to let you try to give this a name in the comment section on YouTube. Oh, I'm sure that's going to go well. But anyway, let's go ahead and get started. And the first thing I attempted to do was make a crust. So I started with some sprouted spelt flour, and to that I added a little bit of sugar, as well as some salt. And then for my fat, I decided to go with olive oil, which I admit's a little unusual, but I was going for kind of a sweet savory thing here, and I thought it would pair perfectly with those fresh figs and goat cheese, which it did eventually. So I poured in some olive oil, which unlike butter, we really can't cut into the flour, so I just gave it a mix with the fork, and once that was mixed in, I went ahead and drizzled in some water, and as soon as it started to sort of clump up, I stopped and transferred everything onto my work surface, which is generally where I like to finish the mixing for these type of things. And because a few spots felt a little bit wet, I added a little more flour. And then basically the plan was to push and press this all together and flatten it out into our traditional dish shape before rolling it out into what I thought was going to be a tart crust. And for a while it was looking pretty good. And then what I wanted to do was transfer it onto a sheet pan where I was going to create this gorgeous kind of freeform tart, like a crostata or one of them there galettes. But when I went to transfer it, disaster struck. It completely fell apart, and I realized quickly, this dough sucks, and it's not going to work. And it was at this point when most smart chefs would have stopped and started over, but that's not how I roll. I decided to stop thinking and start cooking, and what I did was crumble it up and started patting it into the bottom of 2 ramekins. I figured if it's going to crumble anyway, let's just go with it. So I pressed about a 1/4 inch worth into the bottom of each ramekin, sort of like a graham cracker crust. And by the time I had finished applying crumbs to the bottoms of both those dishes, I had turned my frown completely upside down, and all of a sudden things were looking good again. And then once those were set, I started to crumble in my goat cheese. And a pro tip here, make sure your goat cheese is really cold. This had been out for a while, so it was like at room temp, which means it was very sticky and very much not crumble friendly. But eventually I got that done, and it was time to move on to the fresh figs. So I have 3 gorgeous black mission figs that I sliced up to lay over my goat cheese. And by the way, fresh fig is considered the most sensual of all fruit, although you don't really get that if you cut it this direction. If you cut these in half lengthwise, oh yeah, very sensual. But anyway, we're going to slice those up, and I'm going to lay those right on top of my goat cheese. And as you may know, figs are a very sweet fruit, so I wasn't exactly sure how much to put on. But as you can see, I did eventually decide on just a single layer. And then once my cheese had been figged, I gave it a little bit of a pressing. I'm not exactly sure why, but it just felt right. And then, believe it or not, it was time for a little seasoning. So I went ahead and I gave these both a very, very tiny sprinkling of kosher salt, as well as an even tinier shake of cayenne. And relax, nobody's going to taste that. But it is secretly / magically going to brighten everything else up. And then last but not least, we're going to top this with a generous amount of white sugar. So a nice sprinkling of good old-fashioned white sugar. And once that was done, these were ready for the oven. So I transferred these onto a pan and place those in the center of a 450-degree oven for about 20-25 minutes, or until our figs are nicely glazed and our cheese is bubbling. Except what happened after about 5 minutes? I questioned whether my crust was actually going to cook enough because of the insulation of that pan I'd put them on. So not wanting to take a chance, I pulled those off the pan and put them right on the rack, which means a lot more heat's going to go into the bottom of those ramekins. And since it was already hot, I placed that pan underneath, just in case there was any drippage. And like I said, I baked those at 450 for about 25 minutes, or until your cheese is bubbling and those figs are nicely glazed. Check it out. For what started off as a total failure, this looked pretty good. So I let that cool down and decided to garnish with some lemon thyme. I know we didn't use it in the recipe. We're not supposed to garnish with it. That's totally wrong. We're using it right now in the recipe. Not only is this going to provide an amazing aroma, but my guests can pick off leaves and use as much as they see fit. So I dressed it up with a little bit of thyme. And that fresh fig and goat cheese, whatever you guys end up calling this, is done. And for something that started off as a total failure, looking very, very good. But I've seen a lot of things that look gorgeous that didn't taste good. So of course I had to check. And when I grabbed that spoon and cut through that sweet, juicy fig, or at least attempted to, and mixed it with that tangy goat cheese and that earthy, slightly sweet, pleasantly gritty crust, which featured a little pepperiness and a little bitterness from the olive oil, it all ended up being an incredibly delicious bite. Above and beyond showing you a possible new combination of ingredients, I also hope I showed you when things aren't going right in the middle of a recipe, never give up, never give in, because you can almost always still make something incredible. And if you don't and it's horrible, at least you got a story for the water cooler. So I really do hope you give something like this a try soon. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Cherry folded up, also known as a cherry galette in certain French baking circles. But you know what? We're going to call it a cherry folded up just to annoy the French. That's really the only reason. And if you're like me and your favorite part of fruit pies is that crispy crust that gets all soaked with that syrupy, fruity goodness, this is for you. All right, so this is going to start with a very simple pie crust. I'm going to take some whole wheat flour. That's right, I'm using whole wheat this time. So normally I'm not a huge fan of whole wheat flour, but in this it works so perfectly. Some sugar and salt, and then some ice cold butter that I've cut in small pieces. All right, I'm going to use my pastry cutter, my pastry blender, to cut in the butter into the flour, which just means working that butter into the flour until it resembles coarse crumbs. At that point, I'm going to stir in our top secret liquid mixture. I hope you're sitting down for this, because that's a combination of ice water and frozen orange vodka. Oh yeah, vodka in the pie crust. A little trick I picked up from Alton Brown. All right, so I made a well, I poured it in, I started it with a fork. As soon as it starts to come together a little bit, I switch to my hands. And all we want to do is get this dough into some sort of ball or disc. All right, it's going to feel kind of crumbly. Certain spots might be a little wet. Certain spots might be a little dry. It's okay. All right, we want a nice, crisp, flaky dough. So don't do too much with it at this point. As long as you can get it together into a disc like that, wrap it in plastic, and we're going to chill that for a couple hours in the fridge. All right, while our dough is chilling, let's talk about pie filling. This pie, believe it or not, is going to cost me about $18 to make because I'm using these Luxardo maraschino cherries. So these are Italian cherries, pitted, candied in this amazing cherry syrup. Crazy expensive. That jar, $18. I'm not kidding. So you can use any cherry pie filling for this, but if you have access to the Luxardo, give it a try. Unbelievable. All right, a couple hours later, my pie dough has chilled thoroughly. I'm going to roll it out into a large round, about 1/8 of an inch thick. All right, don't worry too much about what it looks like. The great thing about this technique is no matter what it looks like before you put it in the oven, after it bakes, it looks amazing. So I'm going to slowly roll that out, only using enough flour to keep it from sticking. Once I have it to the right thickness, like I said, about 1/8 of an inch, and that's about 13 inches wide, I'd say, 12 to 14 inches will give you a range. I'm going to trim a little bit of that rough edge just because I want to take a pretty picture, but you don't have to. I'm going to roll that up on my rolling pin. I'm going to unroll it on my baking sheet that has a silicone baking mat. In the middle, I'm going to pour 3/4 of a cup of these Luxardo maraschino cherries. Just incredible. And of course, I'll put a link on the blog post for where you can find those if you want to use those. But any canned cherry pie filling will work in a pinch. And for that matter, any fruit filling that you'd use for a pie will work in this. All right, so I'm going to spread the cherries out, but I'm going to leave about 3 or 4 inches all the way around. Then, and here's why it's called a cherry folded up, you're simply going to take the crust and fold it up towards the center like that. And you're going to make 3 or 4 of these big folds, leaving a couple inches in the center open. And that's all there is to it. It could not be easier. And when you're folding, just make sure you make nice, big folds and you tuck the last piece underneath so none of that cherry juice can leak out. The only opening should be in that center there. So if you need to watch that part a couple times of how I was folding that, feel free. But it is a very, very simple process. Just 3 or 4 folds, all gathered up at the center like that, and you're good. Last step, we're going very old school. A lot of times we paint this with an egg wash, but I want to go really rustic. So I'm going to paint this with some milk. And yes, I got it all over. I'm going to paint this with some milk, and then I'm going to liberally sprinkle it, and maybe more than liberally, maybe generously sprinkle it with white sugar. That's going to give it a really, really cool finish, as you're going to see in a couple minutes. Once that's painted with milk and dusted with sugar, it's going to go in a 375-degree oven for about 35 to 40 minutes. All right, how you know it's done? The center is going to be bubbling away, and it will be thoroughly browned all over until it just looks, well, something like that. And you can see that amazing finish that milk and sugar gave the crust here. So beautiful. We're going to make sure we let that cool thoroughly before slicing. And if you do, you get a beautiful clean cut like this. Unbelievable. The perfect proportion of cherry, syrupy filling to crispy, buttery crust. And our little secret ingredient there of that frozen orange vodka helped create that incredibly flaky crust structure there. Just a beautiful thing. And what does this taste like? Imagine the most amazing cherry Pop-Tart ever. That's what this tastes like. Now that looks amazing, but trust me, it tastes 3 to 4 times better than it looks, if you can believe that. And like I said earlier, I'm the kind of pie person that really loves the crust, sort of that crunchy edges of the crust that have the sugary fruit syrup kind of stuck to it. This is like an entire pie of that. So really super simple freeform pie, whatever you want to call it, it's fine with me. A cherry folded up, a cherry galette, whatever. I just hope you give it a try. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts, especially for that top secret vodka pie crust. And as always, enjoy.
Lemon berry tartlets. That's right. Remember that lemon curd we made? I had some leftover and I decided to use that as an excuse to show you how to use puff pastry to make these pretty little tarts. And we love these kind of recipes here at Food Wishes because they look fancy, like they were hard to make, but so not hard to make. In fact, incredibly easy. So check it out. All right, we're going to start on a well-floured board. I have 1 piece of frozen puff pastry. You can find this in any grocery store. I don't want to give a brand, but it rhymes with Pfefferage Parms. And generally they say to let this thaw completely before you work with it, but I'm going to tell you not to. As soon as it's thawed enough to unfold it like this, that's what you want to do. And that's why those seams are kind of rough, because those tear a little bit if you try to unfold it when it's still slightly frozen. But that's really critical because we're going to take this round cutter, we're going to go down the middle of each section and avoid the seam. And why it's so important we do this cutting when the dough is really still super cold is because you want a nice clean cut. All right, if it's over thawed, it's going to smush and smash, and all those beautiful layers of butter and flour in the puff pastry, the thing that makes it puff, will all get mashed together, and it won't work as well. All right, so you really want to use very cold, almost frozen dough. All right, so once our circles are cut, we're going to place those on a sheet pan. I'm using a silicone mat. All right, parchment paper would work fine. And then we're going to take a slightly smaller round cutter and press that into the middle. All right, we're going to go down through, but we're not going to remove that piece. We're just going to leave it right where it is. And you're going to see why after these are baked. So try to get it as centered as possible, just like that. And when all the centers are cut, the last step before we pop these in the oven is to brush it with a little bit of egg wash, which of course is just a beaten egg. It's going to give it a gorgeous color. And that is ready for the oven. We're going to toss that in the center of a very well preheated 400-degree oven. And those are going to bake for about 13 to 15 minutes or until very well browned and fully puffed. Check it out. Of course, some are going to puff up more than others. That's totally normal. And again, that's why it's critical you cut that dough when it's very, very cold, almost frozen, so you get those nice clean cuts, which allows it to rise. All right, you see this one here? I must have smashed that somehow. Did not rise as well. The good news, however, all these are going to work perfectly for the tartlets. Once they're filled, you'll never know. So we're going to let those cool completely. Completely cool. Do not do this next step while they're hot. But once they are, in fact, fully cooled, you're going to take a paring knife and you're going to carefully cut around that little indentation, but you're not going to remove it. You're just going to simply poke it down to the bottom of the tartlet with your finger. That's going to kind of insulate the bottom, but way more importantly, it's going to give us a place to put our filling. In my case, the lemon curd we did. Of course, if you want, you could fill these with things like vanilla custard or a chocolate mousse, something like that, whipped cream. I mean, really, whatever your tart desires. So we're going to spoon our filling in. And then to finish it off, I placed 1 large blackberry on the top of each. I think that looks awesome. All right. Any kind of berries are going to work. Strawberry, blueberry, raspberry, anything in season. And yes, if you thawed it and drained it really well, you could use frozen berries for this. And then one last thing before you start pounding these, I like to give it a little dusting of powdered sugar. Sort of gives it that fancy French pastry shop look. Put them on some kind of decent looking tray or platter. And that is done. Lemon berry tartlets. And how did that buttery, flaky, crispy tart filled with lemon curd and blackberry taste? I think we both know the answer to that question. Fantastic. Really, really delicious. In fact, let me just finish this. And like I said, this is the kind of recipe that looks super hard to do. People think you have mad skills, and you don't. You just watched my video and then took full credit, which is fine. You know I encourage that kind of behavior. So I hope you give these a try. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Tarte Tatin. That's right, or as they say in France, Tarte Tatin. Anyway, this is a very rustic apple tart that's basically just caramelized apples and a crust. And something I've gotten many requests for, so here is how I do mine. So we're going to start by prepping our apples. I have Granny Smith, which are a nice tart baking apple, or so I hear. All right, so cut off the top and bottom, then go ahead and grab a peeler, go around and peel all the skin off. And then we're going to take a knife and cut these in perfect quarters. You really want some nice even cuts, so take your time. Cut it once that way, cut it once the other way. All right. Once you've quartered them, take the knife like this and pull it towards you to take out the core. So basically we want peeled and cored apple quarters. And it's really not that hard. Now if you're going to do these a little bit ahead like I did, go ahead and throw them in some cold water that has a little bit of lemon juice or a little bit of cider vinegar in it to keep them from browning. All right, so our apples are prepped. I did 3 apples. So I have 12 quarters. And once the apples are prepped, we're going to take a 10-inch skillet. This has to be something with a metal handle that can go into the oven. We're going to take some softened butter, a lot of it, like 3 tablespoons, and we're going to rub it all over the bottom and sides of the pan. And I'm talking like generous, embarrassingly thick layer of butter. All right, so don't be shy. All right, once your butter is spread, we're going to pour in, believe it or not, 3/4 of a cup of sugar onto the bottom of the pan. Maybe a little bit on the sides, just a little sprinkle, but most of it on the bottom. And I probably could have just dumped it all in and shook it around, but it felt good to dump it in like that. Enjoy the journey when you're cooking. And then we're going to place in our apples rounded side down, core side up, okay? So just like that, we're going to go around the outside, around the outside, around the outside with the apples. And if you're using a 10-inch pan, and you've cut up 3 good-sized apples, it should just cover it. All right, once your apples are placed in, we're going to go over to the stove, and we're going to place this on medium-high heat, and we're going to wait for it to caramelize. So just like when we made our caramel sauce, you're going to put it on the heat, you're going to be staring at it. Not a lot's going to happen right away, but after a minute or 2, you'll see the butter start to melt and the sugar start to dissolve, and eventually it will start bubbling and caramelizing. I want that caramel to get a nice golden brown color, and I want those apples to soften a little bit. So after about 12 minutes, that's what mine looked like. And at that point, I turned off the heat, and I went to prep my pastry. So I have enough dough for a single crust. I just used the old standard Food Wishes recipe. So we're using a 10-inch pan, so this is about 11 inches across. I want it bigger than the pan. I'm going to go around and crimp the outside before I lay it over, just to get a little head start, because you're going to see what happens here. We're going to place this over the top of the apples, and then we're going to tuck those sides down in. So that little pre-crimping is optional, but it kind of gives you a little head start because that pan's hot. So place it over the top and then try to poke down as far down as you can without sticking your fingers in 250-degree sugar syrup. That's not a good feeling. So be careful. But I want you to push it down all the way around just like that. And that is ready for the oven. So we're going to pop that into a preheated 425-degree oven for 20 minutes or until it looks like this. The crust is going to be beautifully browned. You're going to hear and see that syrup bubbling underneath. You're going to let it cool for 5 minutes, and that's it. 5 minutes, and then for the most terrifying and dangerous part of the operation, the old flip and invert on a plate trick. You're going to put one towel over the top with one hand. You're going to hold the pan with the other. And you're going to do one nice, smooth flip. And then you know what happens? It doesn't come out. So you got to give it the old shake-a, and it will flop out, and it will look terrible. You'll think you have a disaster on your hands, but you don't. They always look like that. Generally, 25-30% of the apples and caramel stick in the pan. But here's the good news. Hot, soft, baked apples and molten caramel sauce is very soft and easy to mold. So simply scoop it out of the pan and place it in the spots where you think it came from. And think about it. Anything missing is in the pan, right? It didn't go anywhere unless you ate it. You ate it? Nice move. All right, don't do that next time. But as long as you don't eat it, spoon it out, fix any of the spots. And of course, as it cools, that sugar's going to tighten up. It's going to get all shiny. And you're going to have, what you see right here, glossy awesomeness. I like to let it cool to room temperature before cutting. And if you do, you're going to have something that looks like that. That beautiful, thin, crispy crust. Those incredibly soft, tender apples, just sweet enough. And yes, you know what's coming next. A scoop of vanilla ice cream. And check that scoop out. There are corporate food stylists weeping right now. Why can't we get our scoop to look like that? Why? And the coolest thing about this is it's just apples and sugar. As you eat this, you're going to swear you're tasting lemon and spices, and it's all just from that caramelized sugar and butter and the natural goodness of the apple. Really, really fascinating dessert. Anyway, there you go, Tarte Tatin. I love a good old-fashioned American apple pie as much as the next red-blooded American, but I gotta admit, once in a while, this is a fantastic alternative. Much lighter, much thinner, very rustic, and yet incredibly delicious. So I hope you give this a try. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Asparagus Tart. That's right, I really wanted to call this asparagus raft, but unfortunately that's not a thing, so we're going with tart. And the usual reason for making these is my love of asparagus, but this time it was my love of using up puff pastry that I found in the freezer. So that's what happened this time, and this was the result. So let me show you how to put this together, and the first thing you're going to need to do is find some frozen puff pastry in your freezer. Or of course buy some. And we're going to put that down on a Silpat lined baking sheet. And as you can see here, that's fully thawed. Very important. It's got to be thawed all the way. And the reason we want this fully thawed is because the first step here is we're going to go around the edge and kind of fold it over and roll it up to make the outside crust. So I'm going to go around with my fingers, kind of folding it, rolling it up like this. And actually, as you can see here, one finger does a fantastic job. And don't worry about trying to make it perfect. This is a rustic tart, okay? And after we've gone around and rolled up that edge, we're going to take a fork and we're going to start pricking it. And we're going to prick it, and we're going to continue pricking it until it's fully and completely pricked over. However, we don't call it pricking. That doesn't sound good. We call it docking. And then once that's been completely and utterly docked, we're going to go ahead and pop that in a 400-degree oven for 10 minutes. And this is just the pre-baking. It's going to get baked again. So we're going to pop that in for 10 minutes. And when it comes out, you're going to be thinking, why did you just make us do all that work? All right, and that's understandable because it doesn't look like we did anything. But fear not. Check this out. We're going to take the back of a fork, and while this is still hot, we're just going to press it down with the back of the fork like that, and the part of the dough that we docked will flatten out, and as you'll see, the part we rolled up around the edge will stay just like that. Okay, so hopefully everybody feels better now. And then all we're going to do is just let that sit there and cool while we prep our asparagus, which is super easy because all we're going to do is give them a very quick boil, and I mean quick. So what we'll do is we'll bring some generously salted water to a boil. We're going to throw in our trimmed asparagus spears, and we're only going to let these cook for 60 seconds. This is referred to as blanching. And of course, that technique was named after its inventor, Chef Blanche. You guys will believe anything, ton. But anyway, like I said, we're just going to give it 60 seconds, and then we're going to fish it out into some ice water. And I say ice water because that's what they told us to use in culinary school, but I always just use very cold water, and it works every time. So save your ice for the margaritas. And then as soon as those are cold, go ahead and drain that and reserve until needed. And then besides the pastry and the asparagus, we're going to need to do a little bit of a creamy mustard sauce for the bottom. So in a ramekin, we're going to take a spoon of Dijon, a little spoon of creme fraiche or sour cream, some freshly ground black pepper, and a pinch of cayenne. And then we'll mix that up well. And you'll notice I'm not putting any salt in here. Our pastry has salt in it. And of course, we blanched our asparagus in very well salted water. So the seasoning should be fine. Plus, we're going to top this with a little bit of Parmesan. So anyway, we're going to mix up that sauce. And then once that's thoroughly mixed up, we'll take a couple teaspoons and we'll spread it evenly into the bottom of our now cooled tart shell. All right, not too little, not too much. I'm recommending you use the perfect amount, as seen here. And then once that's done, we're going to go ahead and take our now drained and dried asparagus spears and lay them in. And as we're laying these in here, let me go ahead and say something super obvious. You're going to need to trim these asparagus so they fit perfectly inside your tart shell.
I mean, the original shape of your puff pastry should be close, but of course you might have to do some fine tuning and trimming. And of course, how many you get in here depends on the size. I was shooting for 5, but right about here I was like, hey, you know what? You could sneak another one in there. Let's do it, which I did. So for me, 6 fit perfectly. And then once our asparagus has been placed in, let's go ahead and take a little bit of melted butter and brush that over the spears. All right, brushing things with butter before they go in the oven is usually never a bad idea. And sure, if you got a couple extra drops, go ahead and brush a little bit on the crust. Although that stuff's like 60% butter anyway, so it doesn't matter, but still. And then last but not least, before this goes in the oven, we're going to give that a very light dusting of Parmesan. And have I mentioned lately you should use the really expensive Parmigiano Reggiano? Okay, so we're going to give that a light but thorough dusting. And then that's going to go back in our 400-degree oven for about 10 to 12 minutes, or until it looks like this. Check it out. That's pretty. That's real pretty. Your crust should be perfectly golden brown, and the color on that asparagus is going to deepen a little, but it should be still a very beautiful dark green. Now at this point, I'm usually telling you to let it cool down a little bit. You really don't have to in this case. You could serve this piping hot, you could serve this warm, you could serve this room temperature. This, believe it or not, is even good cold. So very versatile. So at that point, we're going to go ahead and plate that up. I serve mine with a little charred pepper and arugula salad. That's charred red pepper and arugula, oil vinegar, okay? But anyway, that's it. Simple asparagus tart. I mean, for how gorgeous that looks, that was actually pretty easy. Just a brilliant combination of that crispy, buttery pastry, that sweet, still almost firm, but perfectly tender asparagus, and then just that little touch of creamy mustard sauce underneath, bringing the two main components together. It's just an excellent thing to eat. And speaking of that sauce, don't worry if you think it's going to make everything soggy. It doesn't. Check this out. That bottom's still going to be beautifully browned and crispy. So asparagus should be very abundant right now. And literally every grocery store in the country that has a freezer case sells frozen puff pastry. And because of those two things I just said, I really hope you give this a try. All right? So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Savory Ricotta Tart. That's right, don't let the flatness fool you. Despite coming out a little thinner than we wanted, this thing was thick with herby, cheesy flavor. And besides, it's been a long time since we did a video for people that don't like tall food. So let me show you how to put this together, and as you'll see, it was unbelievably simple. So step 1, we're going to toast a little bit of breadcrumbs in a skillet on medium heat. And of course, we'll do that with the help of a little bit of olive oil. So we'll drizzle that in, we'll mix that up, and there it is. I'm using that spatula again. I know I still haven't explained it, but I promise one of these days I'll give you the whole story. But anyway, like I said, we're going to toast that over medium heat. And what I like to do about halfway through, when I just start seeing it begin to turn a little bit golden, is I like to take a small piece of Reggiano and Parmesan all over the top of this. And it's tough to give quantities with this kind of stuff because it's grated so finely, but it's probably a tablespoon or so. And we'll go ahead and stir that in and continue toasting that until it looks something like this. So that's looking good. And at that point, we can just turn off the heat and just reserve that until our pan is prepped, which is the next step. So I'm going to go ahead and use one of these spring-form pans. Very simple contraption. You got this round bottom, and then you have this ring, which has like a spring latch on it. And the springy ring thing goes on the bottom thing, and it snaps together like that. It's very simple, but if you do get confused, it does come with directions. But anyway, once we put that together, we're going to go ahead and drizzle in some olive oil and brush that all over. And as usual, I'm being pretty generous with the oil. It's okay. It's good for your hair and nails. And at that point, let's go ahead and dump in our toasted breadcrumbs. And we'll go ahead and distribute those evenly. And you can use a spatula, but I think it's better to give it the old shake-a-shake-a. It's probably the best system. Or a combination, up to you. And then once those are all spread out, we can just set that aside and move on to the ricotta cheese filling. So for that, we're going to want to put 2 large eggs in a mixing bowl. And then we're going to take a whisk and we're going to beat those good. Real good. Like for a couple minutes at least. All right, we want this to kind of thicken up and get a little bit frothy and bubbly. So keep beating and beating. And it will kind of turn into more of a yellow color. And then as that thickens up and we introduce even more air, it's going to lighten up even more until it's kind of a pale yellow like this. So right there's perfect. So let's stop and add some seasoning, which for me included some salt, some freshly ground black pepper. I'm also going to add some hot red chili flakes. I want a little heat. Actually, I wanted more than a little heat. That's why I also put in some cayenne. Helps you live longer. Proven scientific fact. And then I love a little bit of fresh herb in this. So I'm going to use a combo of a little bit of parsley and some sweet basil. And I'll go ahead and whisk that in. And as I was mixing, I thought to myself, you should put a little nutmeg in. That'd be good. So I'm going to grate in just a tiny touch. And you know we use the whole nutmeg around here. And really, if you just grate a little bit when you need it like this, it tastes so much fresher and better. And we'll go ahead and give that another mix for no apparent reason.
And then it's time to add the cheese. So I'm going to add about 1.5 cups of a really, really nice, really fresh, local ricotta cheese. Try to use the absolute best one you can. No skim milk, please. And then we're also going to add a big handful of finely grated Parmigiano Reggiano. And is it fine to substitute with the cheap domestic stuff? No. No, it's not. And once our cheeses are in there, let's go ahead and give that a final mix. And then we're going to carefully transfer it into our prepared pan. But don't just dump it in. Let's go ahead and take a spatula and kind of dollop it in gently. See, I don't want those crumbs to move around. And then one slice has more than another, and then your friend's upset, and there's a whole scene. And who needs that kind of drama? So I think this system works better. Just kind of dollop it all over. And then once it's in there, then start spreading it around. And by the way, you'll notice I'm not really referring to those crumbs as a crust, because this really doesn't have a crust. That's just going to give the bottom a little texture and also make it easier to serve. But anyway, like I said, go ahead and carefully spread that evenly. And then, of course, with recipes like this, we come to that very important question. Should I tap that? And in this case, the answer is definitely yes. We want to settle this down in the pan. So we're going to go ahead and give it the old tappa-tappa. But not only that, I'm going to teach you a new one. The old droppa-droppa. Yes, just pick it up and drop it. And by the way, you only have to do it once or twice. I totally got carried away. That'll happen. And then once we've dropped it like it's tart, dropped it like it's tart, dropped it like it's tart, I'm going to go ahead and finish the top with a little more Parmesan. And then after that, we'll also drizzle a little more olive oil. And at that point, our ricotta tart is ready for the oven. So we're going to go ahead and put that in the center of a preheated 325-degree oven for about 25 minutes or until it's set. Which means if you pull it out and give it a little wiggle, you should see just a little jiggle, but it's not going to look wet. All right, you're not going to see like waves in the center. All right, so that's what I mean by set. Just give it a little jiggle, look for the wiggle. And then we're going to go ahead and let this cool down before we do anything else. But one thing I do like to do while it's hot, I like to take a paring knife and just run it around the outside because that's going to contract as it cools. And I don't want anything impeding that contraction. But anyway, that's pretty much it. We're going to let it sit there and cool for at least 15 or 20 minutes before we attempt to unmold this, which I'm going to do now. So we'll unlatch it. We'll take off the ring. And that looks amazingly thin. And we'll talk about that on the blog. But when I've made this before, I've used pie pan, so it was a little thicker. But this time I was trying to do like a thinner tart type object. So next time we'll either do more filling or a smaller pan. But anyway, I can't pretend to be concerned about that at this point. The next step is we're going to throw that on a sheet pan. And don't forget, it's totally cooled down by this point. And we'll dust the top with a little more parm. And then all I'm going to do is put that under the broiler until the top is browned, which really is going to make it look a lot nicer. So I went ahead and set my broiler on high. I put my tart just a few inches underneath. And unfortunately, I don't have a short tripod. So I went ahead and used the old sit on the floor cam. And in a few short minutes later, it looked like this, which I thought was significantly more attractive. And at that point, we're ready to slice and serve. And this is very versatile as far as how you can serve it. You can serve it warm just like this out of the broiler. You can serve it at room temp, which is how I usually do it. But a lot of people actually chill it and serve it cold, which is also quite delicious. And then generally something like this is served with a little salad. So I'm going to fake it with some microgreens and some sliced Cherokee cherry tomatoes. So while it is true you can't fake the funk, you can definitely fake the salad, which I did here. And there you go. A delicious and incredibly simple herbed ricotta tart. And even though it was a little vertically challenged, it was incredibly, incredibly delicious. I just love the texture, love the taste. Like I said, kind of an experiment using this larger springform pan, but we'll play around with it. I don't really make recipes the same way twice, so I don't expect this to be any different, but I really did enjoy this thoroughly, and I hope you give it a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.